This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Haralambous.
Coming up this week, could arbitration be the answer to the solution of the Cyprus problem? That will be discussed at an event tonight at the University of Cyprus, and we talk to the keynote speaker.
So far we failed, and repeating ad nauseum the mantra of invasion and occupation, as if those two words, powerful though they are, will magically lead us to the promised land of a solution. I think we all know that they won't, because they haven't, and over time their ability to do so will only get less.
At 5 o'clock this evening, the Peace Return Project and the Department of Psychology at the University of Cyprus are hosting an event entitled The New Process Design for the Cyprus Talks, Revisiting Arbitration and Mediation Options. And the keynote speaker joins us on this week's programme. He is King's Counsel Konstantin Bartasidis. Konstantin, first of all, let's talk a little bit about your qualifications, if we may, for giving this talk, because you've worked in international arbitration, I think, for several years, and I know you can't share a lot of what you've done because it doesn't go public. But do we here in Cyprus understand what arbitration is?
Well, first of all, hello Rosie, it's great to be here. I think my first qualification to give this keynote is that I was born on this island in December 1969 and left, I like to say, at the invitation of the Turkish paratroop in 1974. Grew up in London, made my life there, my career there. After a few years in Paris, specialised in international arbitration, which has become, across the globe now, probably the main means of resolving international commercial disputes. And to come now back to your question, I've often wondered why we don't use it more on this island, and why Cyprus doesn't present itself as a potential centre for international arbitration, because there's a need and there's a lot of advantages that come from it. But the talk tonight will be about a subject that is particularly close to my heart, which is how arbitration can help find a solution to the Cyprus problem.
It surprises me that this hasn't been looked at before, or perhaps it has, but just explain for ignoramuses like me what's the difference between negotiations that we've been doing for now, 50 years nearly, and arbitration.
So the Cyprus problem is a political problem, and it's a military problem, and it will have a political solution, and that means negotiation, and that means compromise. Arbitration should not be confused with negotiation. Arbitration is a dispositive, quasi-judicial process. Arbitrators decide disputes by application of the law, and they don't seek compromise, and they don't seek a deal that will satisfy everyone. They decide what is right and what is wrong.
But before we go any further, am I right in thinking that if two parties, whether they're commercial enterprises, states or whatever, decide that they will go to arbitration, they agree beforehand that they will abide by the result?
Exactly. They will agree that they will be bound by the result in the same way that they would be by a court order. And there are treaties across the world that will make the arbitral award, the judgment, binding on them. In fact, more binding than a court order across the world, enforceable across the world. And so the result of their agreement is to create a legal obligation in the same way as a court order to respect the result.
Now, does that put people off because they think, maybe I'm not going to like this?
It can, but if you're looking at the range of options that are available, and now I'm coming specifically to the Cyprus problem, one looks at the way in which a dispositive, a binding process has been used in other peace processes that raise the same challenges, and one sees that arbitration can be used to help unknot the most difficult problems within a peace process. Let me give you an example, if I may, because that may bring it to life. Dayton, and I'll talk about this tonight. Dayton was the process at a US airbase in the Midwest by which the Bosnian War was brought to an end in 1995. And that was as we all remember, those of us who were politically conscious then, a particularly bloody war that involved ethnic cleansing on a mass scale. And when the sides were brought together in Dayton in 1995, there were various issues to address: constitutional, territorial, military, security, guarantees, economic. It's starting to sound, or should start to sound, familiar now to Cypriots. There was one issue that at the 11th hour proved a stumbling block, and that was how to draw the inter-entity line, because the basic deal on Dayton was that there would be a federal Republic of Bosnia made up of two constituent states, the Serb Republika Srpska on the one hand, and the Federation of Bosnia-Herzegovina, the other constituent state, on the other, made up of Bosniaks and Croats. And the question was where to draw the line between the two. There were other questions as well. For example, what powers would be devolved to the constituent states, what powers would be held by the federal state. Again, it's starting to sound familiar. But there was one area in particular called Birchko, which was extraordinarily controversial and impossible for either of the political leaders to compromise on. Birchko before the war had been predominantly Bosniak. Those Muslim Bosniaks were ethnically cleansed by Serb forces during the war, and so it was very, very difficult for the Bosniaks to accept that this would not be part of their constituent state. On the other hand, for the Serbs, Birchko lay between the two parts of the Republika Srpska that would be its constituent state, and without Birchko being assigned to it, there would be no contiguity between those two parts of the Republika Srpska. So it's very difficult for the Serbs to compromise on this as well. This issue almost ended the peace talks. At the 11th hour, neither side could compromise.
That sounds familiar as well.
It does. Think Morpho, maybe. Think Famagusta, maybe. So what did the negotiators do? They said, well, why don't you agree, both leaders, that you're not going to compromise, but you will delegate the resolution of this issue to an arbitral tribunal that will decide it, applying law and equity. This is important. This provided a route for both political leaders. They didn't need to compromise. And they agreed to that. They agreed to be bound by an arbitral tribunal, and I'll come to who was on the tribunal, deciding the question of who would have sovereignty and how would Birchko be governed. And they agreed that this arbitral tribunal would apply not only law, so not only the rights and wrongs, black or white, you win or you lose, but also equity, which would allow them to take into account practical circumstances and the hope for peace enduring in the future. So a tribunal was appointed. The Bosniaks appointed a Bosnian Muslim. The Serbs appointed a Bosnian Serb. And the third member, with the casting vote, and actually the ability to decide this by himself if there was no majority, was appointed by the President of the International Court of Justice. And the appointee was someone called Bob Owens, who was a US State Department lawyer. He chaired the tribunal and effectively decided the case, and made very clear that if either side did not participate, the proceeding would continue. And so you simply would deprive yourself of the opportunity, as the Serbs tried, not to participate. And the tribunal ultimately came up with a solution which applied the legal principle that no one who is an aggressor should benefit from their aggression. That was the application of the law. But also equities, that we needed a solution that both sides were invested in and should want to succeed, and came up with the idea that was the subject of their award of condominium ownership over Birchko. Neither state would have exclusive control over it. Both of them would have some control over it. It would effectively be its own state within the federation. And 30 years later, we haven't seen that solution ever break down. That's the way in which the arbitral process provided the political leaders with a means of finding a solution that they could not have agreed by themselves, a solution that has endured.
And so how would you apply that to Cyprus?
Well, my interest is not to be prescriptive. I don't live on this island. While it is very, very close to my heart, I won't live with the consequences. It is for others to decide that. But what I'd like to do, in a small way, is to offer some ideas, some new ideas, some fresh thinking, so that those who are considering the process as a whole are properly armed to find solutions where we haven't found solutions before. Because I think one thing we should all agree on, and that is that so far we failed. And repeating ad nauseum the mantra of invasion and occupation, as if those two words, powerful though they are, will magically lead us to the promised land of a solution. I think we all know that they won't, because they haven't. And over time, their ability to do so will only get less.
Well, we've seen that, haven't we, over, pretty well every year that passes. There are more Turkish settlers coming in, the whole demographics of the island is changing, and yet we still seem to stick to those mantras. I can't really understand why. I've been here a long time, and I can't understand why so many Cypriots seem to not be aware that the situation is getting worse by the year.
Yeah.
And the solution, if and when it ever comes, is going to be certainly much worse for the Greek Cypriots with every passing year.
You know, compromise requires a taking of risk. And to answer your question, why is it that some are unwilling to take that risk? You know, a lot of people have suffered on this island, and they recognise, I suppose, that a solution will bring change, and change will bring its own risk. And I think it's a perfectly respectable position to hold, that perhaps we don't want that kind of change after what we have endured over those years. But what I would say is, let's be honest about that. If that is someone's position, state it openly. Don't pretend and hide behind the words invasion and occupation.
And I want a solution.
And I want a solution. That you are achieving anything other than a default permanent division of the island, because that is what you are doing. So I'd rather have an open and clear and honest debate about it. For my part, the risk is worth taking. Compromise is worth embracing, because I think both positively and negatively it is in this island's interest to look for that. Let me start with the negative, but I'll end with the positive. The negative is anyone watching closely tragic international affairs over the last year, 2 or 3, has realised that we've entered a new age of volatility, where a military solution is far more feasible for a preponderant regional military power than it was even 5 years ago. Even
though a few minutes ago you said that's against international law to benefit from military aggression. And it's still international law.
Look at Ukraine, look at Gaza right now. You know, the reality is that we are closer to military confrontation today, pretty much everywhere, and especially in conflict zones that do not benefit from a permanent settlement, than we were 5 years ago. That means, it seems to me, that there is risk, greater risk today from a non-permanent solution than there has been before. That's the first risk. Second risk of a non-solution. I say this now as a lawyer. We can repeat invasion, occupation as much as we want, but our legal right erodes over time. Just look at the Mobilis versus Turkey decision of the ECHR that is now more than 10 years old, where the ECHR, the European Court of Human Rights, recognised that legal title erodes over time. It becomes less meaningful as a matter of law if you yourself have not possessed land. So let's not think that our legal right is staying the same. It is eroding over time. So these are risks that come from a non-permanent settlement of the Cyprus solution. But let me also mention the opportunity. You know, with the extraordinary ingenuity of its people, Cyprus has become something of an economic success story. But in comparison to what it would be, it has been driving with a handbrake on. And that handbrake is, this is a conflict zone. And that inhibits what it could become. I'm an arbitration practitioner. This could be a regional hub for international dispute resolution, with all the benefits that come from it. That won't happen so long as it is known as a conflict zone.
But we've also had very clear studies about the positive results if there is a solution. For example, the investment that will come in across the island. That's years ago that was published. And again, we all had access to it, including our leaders, and it's just been popped in the bottom drawer.
Well, I think you ask a good question. The World Bank has produced report after report about the influx of capital that will greet a solution internationally, at the European level, privately as well. I think it's very difficult to conceive of what this island will become once a solution is there, but the opportunity, especially for the younger generation, who, looking at polls, it seems to me, are more open-minded about how far we need to go in search of a solution, will be extraordinary. I was in Singapore last week, city-state of 5 million people, gained independence against its will from Malaysia in 1965, leading the leader of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, to give a tearful speech about how Singapore was now a heart without a body. It was a moment of anguish, he called it, for Singaporeans. There was a question as to whether Singapore could survive, whether it was viable by itself outside of the Malaysian embrace. And he said, we have to be better than those around us to survive. Well, Singapore now has the highest GDP per capita in Asia, 7th highest in the world. It is an economic miracle. The opportunities that this island can benefit from are enormous, and we are driving with a handbrake on if we don't see that.
And you're obviously hoping that your talk this evening will help a few people think about whether it's time to take the handbrake off.
I'm hoping so, and I mean, in very concrete terms, I'm hoping that those who are charged with the heavy responsibility of moving the peace process forward again, as it must be moved forward again, can find some nuggets of new ideas in what I say, or variations of what I say, that will be of assistance to them.
Now, how far do you think the influence of the motherlands is important in this? We always say the answer lies in Turkey. We also ask for international help in solving the problem, but then we also turn around and say it's up to us to solve it. We don't want foreign interference. I'm never sure quite what we're looking for.
Yeah. Let me start. It's a great question, Rosie. Let me start by going back to the Dayton Peace Accord. Dayton, I think, recognised and was successful because it recognised that there are concentric circles of agreement that need to be reached. The local, the regional, the international. And so the parties to the Dayton Accord included Croatia and Serbia proper, former Yugoslavia. It wasn't simply the warring Bosnian parties, because without the buy-in of those regional preponderant powers, it simply couldn't have happened. And I rather think that while Cypriots have to lie at the centre of the concentric circle for Cyprus, obviously, that the same must apply here. And so the question for us is how to help those preponderant regional powers take that final step for settlement, how we can make this more attractive to them than less attractive. And so far as Turkey is concerned, it seems to me that involves some element of a European dimension. Linkage is what international relations specialists will call it, linking a solution to the Cyprus problem somehow to a European level deal for Turkey that it will find attractive. I'm not the first to have thought of that, but it seems to me to be an essential part of any solution.
Well, we've seen in the news recently that apparently some bridges are being built between Turkey and Greece, which is met with a lot of differing opinions here on the island, and I just wonder how far the guarantor powers can play a role.
Yeah, I lived through the Northern Ireland peace process as someone growing up and living in London in the 1990s, and I had some I had some political interests at the time and found myself meeting some of the players in the Northern Ireland Troubles, as they were called. And, unlike in Cyprus, blood was being spilt on a daily basis, certainly a weekly basis, in Northern Ireland as a result of the Troubles. And there were hardliners on both sides who thought it was betrayal and treason to sit down at a table and compromise with the other side that had blood on their hands, daily blood on their hands. But the peace process requires looking beyond that and the courage to compromise. And sitting here 25 years after peace in Northern Ireland with the violence having stopped, I don't think anyone today, other than those who shouldn't be listened to, would say that compromise wasn't a price worth paying.
This all begs the question that since it is a frozen conflict, as they say here in Cyprus, as you say, I can't remember the last time there was some blood spilt. It is several years ago now. Are we sitting pretty and actually thinking, listen, there's nothing wrong, we're okay, let's just carry on? But then, of course, we don't think about what will happen if the United Nations suddenly turns around and says, listen, we've been there for how many years, there's no aggro going on at the moment, we can pull out.
And just imagine that those constraints on a local preponderant military power, and you know who I'm talking about, decide to disengage further from the world beyond their own shores. We are sitting maybe 6 months away from a second Trump presidency. Who knows what that will mean for the Eastern Mediterranean? It is a fallacy and a dangerous one to think that Cyprus is secure because the guns have fallen silent these last few years. There is no permanent settlement, and without a permanent settlement, the risk is there.
So you're basically saying that Cypriots on both sides need to be prepared to embrace the risk and deal with it in a way that hopefully will serve everybody's purpose.
I think so, and having spoken to some of those closely involved in the Crans-Montana process in 2016, 2017, I hadn't quite appreciated just how close we got to a solution then, through the great work of some of the professionals in that negotiating team. The remaining gap, as it was then, was certainly bridgeable. It is certainly bridgeable. And I'm hoping that some of the new ideas that others can offer, myself included, will help our government take that final step successfully.
That's interesting, because the government keeps saying we can carry on and pick it up where we left off. Now, if they do that, and what you've just said is true, then it's a very small step. So could arbitration on that final step be the answer?
I think that's exactly what I'm hoping people will ask themselves. It may or may not be the answer, but I want people to think about that. I want those who have that heavy responsibility to be aware of this option. And with that option, armed with that option, who knows, maybe we can take that final step successfully this time.
We certainly hope so. Just before I let you go, can I ask you about the talk you're also giving in Limassol for Cyprus Arbitration Day? And that's an event organised by, I didn't know we had one, a Cyprus Arbitration Forum. What's that all about? You're hoping to put us at the centre of, let's say, the geopolitical area in terms of arbitration?
Yeah, there's an international race that's been happening over the last 20 years, pretty much since I began practising international arbitration 25 years ago, which is really big business now. And that is to develop different hubs, different centres of international arbitration, because those hubs, those centres attract a great deal of investment as a result. And I was in Singapore last week, I was in Hong Kong last week. I'm based in London, which is one of the main centres of international arbitration. It struck me as someone of Cypriot origin, who's looked at the talent on this island, that's looked at the quality of the common law judiciary on this island, that's looked at the instability around it in this region, that Cyprus has many of the natural attributes that would make it a successful centre regional centre for international arbitration going
But
forward.
would people look upon us as a centre for that when we've got our own problem that we haven't solved?
I think there is a connection, and that's why I think both of the speeches I'm giving are not unrelated. If you look at one of the traditional centres of international arbitration, Switzerland, which has been a centre for international arbitration since the famous Alabama arbitration in the 19th century, which grew out of the US Civil War with the Union Party suing the United Kingdom for its surreptitious building of ships used by the Confederacy to scupper Union commercial vessels. Place of arbitration, Switzerland. Switzerland developed as a centre for international arbitration and has benefited greatly from that for the last 150 years because it was seen as a centre of neutrality, as a centre of stability, as well as a centre of legal excellence.
So you're putting the cart before the horse a little bit.
I'm hoping that both can move in the right direction. As someone born on this island who left it in circumstances that I will never forget, I'm hoping to bring the two worlds of my life together, a solution to the Cyprus problem and Cyprus's evolution as a regional centre for international arbitration.
It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for your time. That is the keynote speaker at this evening's event, the new process design for the Cyprus talks, revisiting arbitration and mediation options. King's Counsel Konstantin Bartasidis. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Rosie.
This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Haralambous.
Other stories making the news this week. Independent investigators are to be appointed in the case of Thanasis. That, you may recall, we've reported on before, was the National Guardsman found dead under a bridge in the Limassol district, and for 19 years it's been going back and forth between the courts, the police, the Attorney General's office, and finally last week a court agreed that he was a victim of murder and his death was not, as has been held for so many years, suicide. So independent investigators are to be appointed to look further into it. His mother said she feels vindicated because she always knew that her son would not have committed suicide. And still with issues of justice, the legal service and the anti-corruption authority found themselves embroiled in conflict this week over the former's decision not to prosecute former police drug squad chief Michalis Katsounotos. He had been called by a team of lawyers appointed by the anti-corruption authority to speak to them as part of an investigation into Deputy Attorney General Savas Angelidis' alleged conflicts of interests. Now, while Katsounotos appeared in front of the experts, he insisted that he was not obliged to answer their questions, and he refused to answer some of them. The legal experts, 2 British barristers and 1 Cypriot lawyer, suggested that his refusal to speak may have made him criminally liable, but the legal service refused to initiate proceedings against him. On Wednesday this week, the Anti-Corruption Authority was scathing. According to a report in the local press, they said that after studying the report submitted by the legal experts it appointed, the authority has come to the conclusion that a police officer who had been called as a witness in the process disobeyed the provisions of the legislation. The relevant laws impose an obligation on any person who receives a summons to appear either before the authority itself or before appointed inspectors, not only to attend, but to answer all the questions put to them. The Anti-Corruption Authority went on to say that they had transferred the file to Attorney General George Savvidis with a recommendation that a criminal investigation be conducted with a view to a possible criminal prosecution of Katsounotos. However, they said Savvidis had declined their request, saying that Katsounotos had the right to remain silent. It's not clear now what happens next. Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.